All right, so layout fundamentals. This is going to be an interesting topic because it's the kind of thing that modelers typically argue about in forums and in chat rooms and what have you. And this relates to assumptions and outputs and how you might potentially organize them. So there's two fundamental ways in which you can actually lay out assumptions and outputs within a model. And I'll use the Modano lingo just because it's more consistent. You can either have separate assumptions and outputs, or you can have what we refer to as single components. Now, separate assumptions and outputs split assumptions and outputs across worksheets. And what this means is I'm going to be entering my assumptions in one location, and they're going to have an impact on the outputs on a separate location that I can't necessarily see. By comparison, single components are assumptions and outputs that are on the same worksheet, typically as the name suggests, within the same component, and they're very proximal to each other. Now, as you can imagine, this decision has a fundamental impact on the model. And the two main areas in which it has an impact on the model are primarily, user interface, as you would imagine. The other aspect is more related to model longevity. So for example, if I go for separate assumptions and outputs, from a user feedback perspective, the downside is that I'm entering assumptions, but I can't see the impact they're having. I enter assumptions in one location and, the impact on the outputs, I can't see them because they're on a separate worksheet. By comparison with a single component structure, you enter assumptions and you see the impact directly below them. So from a user perspective, you get great feedback instantly as to the impact your assumptions are having on calculations and outputs. From a general usability perspective, they have a better flow to them, we tend to find. People have assumptions, outputs. As long as the assumption cells are clearly labeled, people, and particularly less capable modeler types, find these models a lot easier to use. Now, in terms of the model life, if I have separate assumptions and outputs, it's unambiguous as to what the purpose of an entire worksheet is. So I go to my assumption sheet, that's where I'm typing in numbers. I go to my output sheet, that's where I'm just looking at things. So what we tend to find with models that have separate assumptions and outputs, they last an incredible amount of time, because there is a dedicated interface and there is a dedicated output location. Now, by comparison, when you start to look at a model that combines assumptions and outputs together on the same worksheet, it becomes a little bit more ambiguous as to what somebody should be doing. And to the extent that somebody doesn't have, say, a Modano model and they've just got a more traditional manual Excel file, it's very easy for them to start typing numbers over the top of calculations, because it isn't so self-evident that the purpose of that worksheet is simply to either enter assumptions or look at outputs. And that's all I'm going to say. There's a huge depth to this topic, but in terms of the key points that I think you need to consider from a scoping perspective, usability is the key idea, and there's also a latent impact in terms of model lifespan.